Hey Nomad Sculptors, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you how I made this foot and some of the principles that came into play when I was sculpting it. You will also see me apply some of the things I spoke about in previous videos. And you'll see a brief demo of how I painted the skin and got some of the textures in it. So I hope you enjoy watching. So of course, like with all my sculpts, I started off with a lot of references, which aren't shown here, but I had a whole lot that helped me to imagine where I wanted to go with this sort of study. I made sure to start off using the basic shapes. This is a key foundation that will help you to have it easier when you get to the more detailed parts of the sculpt and worrying about more directly anatomy and things like that. So using the references that I found, I divided the foot into 3 basic shapes, one for the heel, one for the midfoot, and also for the toes. As you'll see later on, the part for the toes is just a stand-in, and later on I'll replace it with a tube tool. You can see in the outset that I'm using very low poly shapes. This makes it easy for you to quickly shape it, and it also removes the temptation from getting too detailed too quickly. So this is just a way to make sure that you have the primary shapes down first so that you can have, again, a solid foundation to work with. If you have trouble picturing the basic shapes, you can look online for a lot of resources about figure drawing, especially for the foot, that helps to break it down into those simple shapes, and you can basically just copy those shapes down. I think I did that in my first video with the skull, and I sort of did a similar thing with the hand, but here again I'm doing that because it's a very effective way to start sculpting. It's something that traditional sculptors in clay use, and I try to emulate it using Nomad because it behaves a lot like sculpting in clay. You'll notice when I'm putting in the ankle that it had a slight angle to it, something like 20 or 30 degrees, and you can see that on the inside of the foot that the ankle is higher, and on the outside it appears lower. So you can just keep that in mind when you're doing realistic anatomy for the ankle. Throughout this video, you'll see me using the tube tool for a lot of the organic shapes. I used it here for the shin as well as for the toes. So think about ways you can use it when blocking out your model, and it really makes life easy, especially when you're doing organic shapes. Once I'm happy with the individual basic shapes, I start to voxel merge them. Then I started doing a little bit of sculpting to continue to work out the primary shapes. If you're still studying anatomy, it may take you a little longer at this stage because you're not used to seeing the proportions by eyesight alone, and it's something that I was free to do at this point because I wasn't using it in conjunction with an entire body, but I could judge basically based on my experiences and the references exactly how big things are and how they should be positioned. So exercise a little patience and just take your time and get this part right, because once you have a very good foundation, then the rest is much easier. Once I was happy with the overall shape of the foot, you can see I started using the tube tool to block out all the toes. And later on I'll replace some of these, but I put them in place so that I can see where I'm going. Something else I did with the tube tool is that I use each point on the line as a joint. so that I had those landmarks early in place, and it made it easier so I didn't have to work it out again once I validated the shape. I started modeling the big toe first because it's the most unique shape of all of the toes, and once I had that worked out, then I moved on to the rest. And I just worked my way back towards the little toe, and you'll see that I just basically duplicated the rest of the toes because they're so similar in shape overall. I just had to do very little adjustments using the move brush so that I could get the shape that I wanted. At this point, you're going to start to see the holes in your understanding of the anatomy of the foot, and there you start to use your references heavily so that you can get things right. It's about this point that you realize how much you need good references. The final image of a foot may be still a little bit too difficult to understand, so it's important to have anatomy references so you can see what's going on under the skin. When you understand what's going on under there, the big underlying structures, then it helps you to really picture what you need to sculpt and how it affects the surface. So just take your time and make sure that you get that part right. You may notice that majority of this video is just about sculpting and getting down the primary shapes. So I encourage you to take your time and to do the same when approaching especially complex shapes, and with a little patience you'll get it right. Another thing that you may notice is that I keep the toes separate for as long as possible. Once I work out all the big shapes, it's easier to incorporate it to the rest of the model. So that's just how I approach it. Some may try to build it up, but that's a little bit more of a challenge and a little more tedious in my opinion. So just having the separate shapes and then merging them later is an easier way to do it. However, doing it this way comes with its own problems, and we will discuss a little bit more about that later on in the video. Once I was happy with the overall shape of the toes, I started blocking out the toenails. You can see I approached it very similar to what I did before in a previous video. What I do is I use the mask tool to draw out the shape of the toenail, then I invert the mask and use the drag tool to gently draw out the nails. I also use the move tool to kind of shape the nail a little bit to get that nice curve. Once I was done with the nail, then I invert the mask and then start to sculpt the nail fold. Then when I'm done with that, I get rid of the mask and then I start to do some cleanup using the crease tool as well as a smooth brush. Just before merging the toes to the rest of the foot, I sculpt the points where they'll merge. It's like building a bridge from opposite ends and meeting in the middle. It reduces cleanup after the merge and makes it simpler to make secondary shapes. I also remind myself not to create any final shapes just yet, as voxel merging tends to move the vertices around a little even when set to high resolutions. This prevents spending double the time on the same form. As mentioned before, I ran into some issues when I started voxel merging the toes to the rest of the foot. What was happening is some artifacts happening. When two objects are too close, it tends to cause some flip normals and some of the vertices kind of get out of place. So what I did was a little quick and dirty trick. I just simply use a smooth tool to correct some of that, which is easy, but some have also been merged. So I did a little thing where I just used a trim tool very carefully to split it, and then I use a smooth tool again to go back in and smooth out what I could. I didn't spend too much time on this part because where it was happening was somewhere that would not be seen in the end. So don't get too obsessive with these details unless it's part of your project and it's a key thing that will be seen. So that's just what I did just to quickly sort that out. Once I sorted out that crazy toe situation, I started moving on to the secondary shapes of the foot. I used a clay brush to start defining a lot of the secondary shapes. These are the underlying shapes that affect the surface. So while doing this, I paid close attention to the anatomy and started dropping the landmarks all around the foot. And then later on, I go back in and start to carve or to add clay and then smooth everything out with a smooth brush. And still at this point, I'm not adding any other details like wrinkles. That's the tertiary shapes and I'm not quite there yet. So I'm still in my mindset in the secondary level and just making sure that again these bigger shapes are sorted out before moving on to any fine details. this stage, I didn't want the foot to look too relaxed, so I added life to it. As you can see in some of the tendons, I have them flexed to suggest some tension. This is a small detail that we may overlook, especially when we're concentrating on getting the anatomy right, is adding some life to the shapes and deciding the pose and what it will look like. Will it be completely relaxed? Will there be some tension, some twisting? When you think about these things, it really adds a lot to your sculpt. In this case, the effect is quite subtle, but I think it added some life to it. Something you may notice too is that I changed from orthographic view over into perspective with my camera. The reason for the change is because in orthographic view, I work out the proportions, and once I'm comfortable with the proportions, then I can move over into a perspective that is similar to what I will present it at as a final render. So just be mindful of what camera view you're using, whether it's orthographic or perspective, especially in the early stages. Then I moved on to working on the foot pad. I created some unevenness to give it a little bit believability of fleshiness and life. How successful I was at doing that, you be the judge, but again, this is a study and that's where we come to learn. And once I was done with the foot pad, I think that drew to a close the primary and secondary stages of this sculpt. I created a new layer and then started to add the details when it came to the wrinkles as well as the veins, and really starting to put the finishing touches that made it come to life. For those of you who are new to Nomad Sculpt, yes, you can sculpt on different layers. So you can work hard on a base model and then you can create a separate layer and then start to work on that. And if for some reason things go sideways when you're working on that layer, you can either minimize how visible it is, reducing its effect, or you can delete it altogether and start again. So I really like that flexibility. Throughout this entire sculpt, you can see I'm using the same basic tools to achieve all the results that I'm getting. This is true in other sculpting software as well. So just master the basics, and then all the other things that may seem overwhelming will start to play their role once you have a solid base. So just start simple, master the new tools, and then eventually the specialty tools will be easier to use and you'll have a strong understanding of when to employ them. coming to the end of the sculpting phase, it's really a game of inches from here on out. And this is where you just do a little bit of polishing and refining and just making sure with the move brush that the proportions are right, things are the right shape, and all these little adjustments towards the end. And then I moved on to texturing the skin. These textures were custom made using True Grip brushes that I bought for Procreate. So I repurposed the textures and used them for finishing my models. These weren't real to life skin textures. These were just some that approximate the look of skin from a certain distance. So it's really an improvisation, and sometimes that's all you need, especially if your model going to be viewed from a distance. I applied this texture using a separate layer again, and what I did, I used the stamp tool and reduced its strength all the way down to 1%, and then I started pulling out the texture. And what I did as well while pulling out the texture was rotating it a little bit so that it could create some variety, and again it would just kind of approximate the texture of the skin. Once I was done applying all the textures, I used the layer slider to adjust the intensity of the texture in conjunction with the smooth tool to get the desired result of a smoother skin. Notice I didn't apply the texture to every part of the foot. I wanted to kind of imply that there was different types of skin on it, and so that it can add a little bit more to the details and make it look a little more believable. So with all the sculpting and texturing complete, it was time for me to start applying paint. For this model, I tried out a new painting technique I picked up from Sideshow Collectibles. I basically start with a base flesh tone, then added yellow and red and blue washes to the skin. I also used a depth filtering brush to define bumps and grooves of the form. Then I added some red texture to the skin to simulate blood vessels. I worked on separate layers for all the different washes so that it was easy for me to adjust it if I needed to, but thankfully I didn't have to do it in this case. The same approach was taken too for getting the color of the veins. I took my time to build up the color, and then I used the opacity on the layer itself so that I could adjust it to something that approximates a realistic look. A wash is really another way of saying low opacity. It's just like diluting paint in water. That, coupled with the depth filtering, resulted in the effect I was going for. I'll do my best to explain this process in more detail in a future video. I moved on to the toenails. My original idea was to make them all natural and just to show you how you can just have a separate material where it's a little bit more glossy so you can differentiate between the skin and the toenail. So what I did, I selected a color without giving too much thought to it for the purpose of helping me to see exactly where I was painting on the nail, because later on that color was not supposed to be a part of it. But the color worked so well that I decided to keep it. You can see here I'm adding some detail to the veins and again being restrained in my choice of color and application of it. When doing this, it's important to be mindful of the roughness and metalness that it matches the skin, so do your best not to change that. That's the basic overview of how I made this sculpting Nomad, and if you want more information on any particular thing, please let me know in the comments below, especially when it comes to the painting. I hope to spend some more time showing that in future videos, and I also have some shorts that introduce you to how to use the painting tools more effectively. So if you're a newbie, please check out my YouTube shorts. They're geared towards helping you getting up and running in Nomad. If you're new here, please subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss a thing. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.